They laughed when she stayed quiet. They adjusted the contract mid-dinner, assuming she couldn't understand a word they were saying. Power feels safe when you think no one is listening. What they didn't know was that she understood everything, and she was waiting. By the time they realized their mistake, it wasn't just the deal that was gone. That was the night everything shifted. They invited her to sign away her own company because they thought she didn't understand English. They laughed. They raised their glasses. They called her a wall. What they didn't know was that she understood every word, and the quietest person in the room was about to expose them. If you believe silence can be mistaken for weakness in dangerous ways, stay with me. And before we go further, subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. Stories like this deserve to be told carefully and remembered. I've worked around international deals long enough to recognize the tone of arrogance before it fully forms. It's subtle at first, a joke that lingers too long, a comment disguised as efficiency, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When I first heard about this dinner, it unsettled me. Not because deals fall apart, that happens every day, but because of why this one nearly succeeded. The setting was a private waterfront dining suite in Seattle, floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline reflecting off dark water, a table set for 12, though only 4 people truly mattered. At the far end sat Mariko Sato, founder of a global supply chain firm headquartered in Osaka, late 50s, composed, impeccably dressed in a minimalist black silk ensemble inspired by traditional kimono lines. She spoke limited English in public settings and relied on a translator seated beside her. Across from her, at the head of the table, sat Charles Beaumont, a private equity executive with the kind of reputation that made junior analysts straighten their posture when he entered a room. Next to him, Victoria Hale, brilliant, calculated, known for structuring acquisitions that left her firm firmly in control. The dinner's purpose was simple on paper: finalize a strategic partnership between their firms. The valuation hovered just under $800 million. But here's what struck me when I studied this case later. The negotiation had already been decided in Charles's mind before the first course arrived. Halfway through the appetizers, he said it, not even quietly. What's the point of bringing someone to the table if she can't even follow the conversation? There was a ripple of restrained laughter, the kind meant to signal alliance. I've seen that dynamic before, the formation of an invisible in-group. Language becomes a gate. Fluency becomes a weapon. Mariko sat still. Her expression didn't change. Her translator softened the comment before relaying anything at all. Victoria leaned forward later in the evening, swirling her wine. Global business requires confidence, she said. If you can't articulate your vision directly, it's difficult to lead. I want to pause here, because this is where so many people misunderstand what they're seeing. In American boardrooms, dominance is often equated with speed and volume, quick responses, sharp rebuttals, eye contact held just a second longer than necessary. In Japanese corporate culture, particularly among executives of Mariko's generation, silence is often strategic. Listening is assessment. Composure is leverage. But Charles and Victoria didn't interpret it that way. They interpreted it as absence, and that assumption shaped everything that followed. Near the end of dinner, Charles produced a thick contract from a leather portfolio. He slid it across the linen toward Mariko with a polished fountain pen. Nothing complicated, he said. Standard governance adjustments for operational efficiency. The translator reached for the document. Victoria gently intercepted it. We've streamlined the structure. It benefits everyone. What they did not say, what they assumed would go unnoticed, was buried in Section 5. Control provisions transferring primary decision-making authority to their firm. Mariko's role reduced to advisory oversight. Advisory. In the company she built over 30 years. There was one more person in that room that night. A server named Elena Ruiz. 26. Efficient. Nearly invisible by design. She moved between wine glasses and water pitchers without interrupting the rhythm of power. Her manager had instructed her before service began. Stay out of their line of sight. These are serious people. I've always wondered about that phrase. Serious people. As if dignity is reserved for those with titles. Elena understood Japanese, not casually, fluently. She had lived in Kyoto for years while teaching English after college. It was a part of her life no one in that hotel knew about. As she poured water near Charles's shoulder, she heard him murmur to Victoria, "Low, but not low enough. She won't know the difference. By the time her team reviews it, we'll control the board." That was the moment everything changed. And what fascinates me, what keeps me thinking about this night, is not just that they underestimated Murako, it's that they never once considered the possibility that someone they deemed invisible might understand every word. What happened next wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was slower than that, more insidious, like watching someone test how far they can push without being challenged. After that whisper about controlling the board, the energy at the table shifted in a way most people wouldn't have noticed unless they were looking for it. Charles grew more relaxed, almost indulgent. Victoria's tone sharpened, not outwardly hostile, but subtly patronizing. The kind of voice people use when they believe the outcome is already secured. They began speaking about Mariko as if she were a variable in a model rather than the architect of a multinational operation. In the American market, Charles said, leaning back in his chair, speed is survival. Decisions can't be slowed down by translation layers. Translation layers. I've heard phrases like that before. Language reduced to friction. Culture reduced to inefficiency. Victoria added, centralized authority ensures clarity. Too many regional sensitivities dilute execution. That line stuck with me when I first analyzed this dinner. Regional sensitivities. What she meant was autonomy. What she meant was control that didn't belong to them yet. Mariko listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She didn't rush to prove competence. And to Western eyes trained to equate immediacy with confidence, that restraint can look like uncertainty. But here's something I've learned from years of sitting in cross-border negotiations. The person who speaks least often gathers the most information. Silence creates asymmetry. While one side performs dominance, the other side observes character. Charles mistook Mariko's quiet for dependence. He began explaining market fundamentals as though she had not already built distribution networks across 3 continents. Victoria referenced educating partners on modern governance standards, her words polished, corporate, carefully shielded from overt insult, yet heavy with implication. No one at the table called it out. That's another pattern I've noticed in rooms shaped by power. Discomfort rarely converts into intervention. People protect access before they protect fairness. Meanwhile, the translator's posture grew tighter. He hesitated more often before relaying comments. He softened phrases. He removed edge. I don't blame him. Translators in high-stakes environments carry invisible ethical burdens. They are expected to transmit language, not emotion. But when contempt hides inside language, neutrality becomes impossible. I often tell younger executives that cultural intelligence is not about memorizing etiquette rules. It's about recognizing when your confidence has crossed into assumption. An assumption is expensive. As the contract lay open between them, Charles began narrating its benefits in broad strokes: operational synergy, streamlined governance, global scalabilities, abstract comfort. What he did not emphasize were the mechanics: voting thresholds, board composition adjustments, authority over capital allocation. The architecture of control was buried in procedural language dense enough to discourage casual review. And that's where arrogance becomes visible to anyone paying attention. They positioned the document as routine. They discouraged detailed translation under the guise of efficiency. They framed urgency as professionalism. I've seen this strategy before: compress the timeline, dominate the tempo, reduce scrutiny. But tempo only works when both parties accept the rhythm. Mariko turned a page slowly. Her eyes moved deliberately across each paragraph. She asked her translator a brief question in Japanese, quiet, precise. Charles tapped the table lightly with his pen, a small, impatient rhythm. In American business culture, impatience is often worn as proof of importance. But in many East Asian corporate traditions, impatience signals lack of discipline. And discipline, not speed, is the currency of longevity. Victoria leaned in. "We trust you see the upside," she said, smiling in a way that suggested the alternative would be naive. That sentence, to me, was the clearest window into their mindset. Trust you see the upside, not trust you understand the terms, Not trust this aligns with your strategic goals. Just trust the upside. Profit framed as self-evident. Oversight framed as unnecessary. What they failed to account for was that Marco had spent decades navigating Western markets. She had encountered charm. She had encountered pressure. She had encountered polished persuasion dressed as partnership. Silence, in her world, was not surrender. It was filtration. And in that filtration, something else was happening. Something Charles and Victoria never noticed. Elena was still moving quietly between place settings. But she was no longer simply observing behavior. She was processing intent. In moments like this, I always ask myself, at what point does witnessing become responsibility? Because that dinner was no longer just a negotiation. It was becoming a test of ethics, of cultural humility, of whether power unchecked would proceed unchallenged. And the most dangerous thing about arrogance is that it rarely sees the moment before it is exposed. And that exposure came from the one person no one had bothered to measure. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a room just before something irreversible happens. Not awkward, not tense, just suspended, like the air knows a boundary is about to be crossed. Elena felt it before anyone else did. She would later describe it as a tightening in her chest, the kind you get when you realize that staying quiet will cost more than speaking. I've thought about that moment often, because it forces a question most professionals avoid. What do you owe a stranger when you witness deception in real time? She had been instructed to disappear. That was her job. Blend into the background. Keep the glasses filled. Leave no imprint. But as Charles summarized the efficiency adjustments one final time, and Victoria gently steered the translator away from reading specific clauses aloud, Elena understood something clearly. This was not aggressive negotiation. It was calculated concealment. She set the water pitcher down, not abruptly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Then she stepped around the table and stopped beside Mariko. I imagine her heart was racing. Mine would have been. Jobs in luxury hospitality are not forgiving environments. You do not interrupt clients who control more capital than you will see in a lifetime. Elena bowed, not casually, not playfully, but correctly, with intention. The kind of bow that signals respect within Japanese culture. A gesture that does not belong in an American boardroom unless someone truly understands its meaning. And then she spoke in Japanese. Nakamura-sama, the contract shifts controlling authority. They are not presenting it accurately. The sentence was steady, clear, unrushed. Time fractured. Charles froze first. His expression moved from confusion to irritation in seconds. Victoria's composure tightened, the polite corporate mask beginning to crack. What did she just say? Charles demanded. It's interesting to me how quickly authority shifts from confident to defensive when it is challenged. A moment earlier, he controlled the tempo. Now, he needed information. Mariko looked at Elena, not startled, not embarrassed, but searching. Please explain, she replied softly in Japanese. Elena did. She referenced the section, the governance clause, the advisory limitation. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply translated intent. I want to pause here because this is where the story becomes larger than a dinner. Courage rarely feels cinematic in the moment. It feels risky, unstable, potentially self-destructive. Elena was not defending a friend. She was not protecting her own investment. She was stepping into a power structure that had no reason to protect her. Charles tried to reassert dominance. This is completely inappropriate, he said sharply. You're out of line. That phrase, out of line, is fascinating. It reveals the invisible boundaries people assume exist. Hierarchies, roles, permissions. But Mariko did not look at Charles. She looked at Elena, and then, slowly, she shifted her gaze across the table. When she spoke next, it was in English. Calm, measured, unapologetic. I understand everything that has been said tonight. There is a unique stillness that follows the collapse of a false assumption. Victoria blinked. You understood? Yes, Mariko replied. Every word. I've replayed that line in my head many times, not because of its shock value, but because of what it reveals about discipline. She had chosen silence. She had absorbed the insults. She had allowed character to surface fully before responding. Listening is power when the other side believes you cannot hear. She turned to Charles. In my country, respect is established before partnership. You offered persuasion, not respect. There was no anger in her tone, That made it more devastating. Then she lifted the contract and tore it, paper splitting down the center of a room built on polished confidence. That sound, thin, dry, unmistakable, marked the end of the negotiation. But more than that, it marked the inversion of the room's hierarchy. The executives who believed language gave them leverage had been undone by it, not because they lacked intelligence, but because arrogance blinded them to possibility. And what stays with me most is not the tearing of the document, it's the look on Charles's face. Not rage, not even embarrassment, but disbelief. He never imagined that the quiet woman at the end of the table had been evaluating him the entire time. He never imagined that the server refilling his glass possessed the cultural fluency to dismantle his strategy. Underestimation is seductive. It allows you to feel superior without earning it. But in that room, underestimation became fatal. And in one controlled sentence, followed by the quietest act of defiance, ripping paper, the balance of power shifted permanently. The sound of that contract tearing didn't just end a deal. It triggered consequences none of them had calculated. In high-level business circles, people like to believe that what happens in private stays contained. Confidential rooms, discreet staff, unwritten rules of silence. But power creates witnesses, and witnesses sometimes carry records. What Charles and Victoria didn't know that night was that one of the junior associates seated farther down the table had been recording portions of the dinner, not maliciously at first. He had intended to document what he assumed would be a landmark partnership, a celebratory clip, a trophy moment for internal archives. Instead, he captured something else entirely: the remark about language, the dismissive laughter, the pressure to bypass translation, and finally, Mariko's measured declaration that she had understood everything. Within days, the recording circulated quietly among industry insiders. Then it moved faster. Investors talk, analysts share, competitors listen carefully for weakness. I've seen reputations unravel slowly over years. This one unraveled in weeks. Charles's firm issued a statement emphasizing context and misinterpretation. They framed the evening as a cultural misunderstanding amplified by incomplete footage. But context becomes difficult to defend when tone is unmistakable. 2 institutional investors paused pending commitments. An overseas pension fund withdrew entirely, not because the deal failed, deals fail all the time, but because trust had fractured. And here's the truth many executives underestimate. Capital is mobile. Trust is fragile. When international partners question your cultural competence, they question your risk management. When they question your risk management, they question your judgment. Victoria attempted a more personal response. She spoke at a leadership forum weeks later about lessons in cross-cultural sensitivity. It sounded rehearsed, careful, controlled. But the industry has a long memory. Transformation is credible only when it precedes exposure, not when it follows it. Meanwhile, inside the hotel, a different conversation was unfolding. Elena had expected immediate termination. She had stepped outside the defined boundaries of her role. She had interrupted high-profile clients. In most corporate structures, that is grounds for dismissal. But the video changed the calculus. Public scrutiny shifted toward the hotel's internal culture. Why had a server been instructed to remain invisible? What did that imply about how staff were valued? Suddenly, leadership needed to demonstrate alignment with integrity. Elena was not fired. She was promoted. Guest relations coordinator, salary increase, formal acknowledgement for upholding the organization's commitment to ethical conduct. It's easy to be cynical about corporate responses after public backlash, but I've come to believe that even reactive change can create meaningful shifts. Institutions evolve when they are forced to confront their blind spots. 3 days after the story began circulating beyond private circles, Elena received a call. Mariko's voice was steady, warm, deliberate. "I would like to speak with you about a new initiative." Mariko was expanding her company's global operations, but this time she intended to formalize something that had previously been instinctive: cultural integration as a strategic function, not an afterthought. She offered Elena a position in Osaka, Director of Cross-Cultural Development, Relocation Support, Leadership Authority, a salary that multiplied her previous income several times over. Equity participation tied to international growth. I often reflect on that offer. It wasn't charity. It wasn't gratitude alone. It was recognition. Mariko understood that Elena had demonstrated something rare: moral courage in asymmetrical power conditions, the ability to speak when silence would have been safer. And that quality, more than language fluency, is invaluable in global business. Charles's firm survived. Firms that size rarely collapse overnight. But they became more cautious, more scrutinized. Invitations slowed. International expansion stalled. Victoria recalibrated her public image. She began advocating for inclusive negotiation practices. Some believed it was growth. Others believed it was survival strategy. Mariko's company, however, moved forward with strengthened partnerships, not because she avoided risk, but because she selected partners differently. Respect became a filter. And that's the ripple effect that fascinates me most. One decision at one dinner table reshaped careers, redirected capital, redefined internal policies, launched a new executive role dedicated entirely to preventing exactly what had nearly occurred. People assume dramatic change requires dramatic force, but sometimes it begins with a single sentence spoken at the right moment and the refusal to let arrogance go unchallenged. And when the headlines faded and the industry moved on to its next scandal, what remained wasn't the embarrassment, it was the lesson. I keep coming back to this story because it exposes something most leadership seminars only hint at. The greatest risks in global business are not financial models or market volatility. They are human assumptions. This was never about grammar. It was never about pronunciation. It was never about who could deliver the sharpest presentation in flawless English. It was about how quickly power convinces itself that it deserves obedience. When Charles assumed fluency equaled superiority, he revealed a blind spot that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with ego. When Victoria framed control as efficiency, she demonstrated how easily language can sanitize dominance. And when Mariko chose to remain silent until character had fully revealed itself, she demonstrated something far more powerful than confrontation: restraint. In American business culture, we often celebrate assertiveness as the ultimate strength. Speak up, lean in, take the room. But what I've learned from watching leaders across different cultures is that power expressed too quickly can expose insecurity. True authority doesn't rush to prove itself. Mariko did not interrupt. She did not argue mid-sentence. She did not demand immediate respect. She observed, and observation gave her clarity. There is a discipline in listening that most executives underestimate. When you allow someone to keep speaking, you allow them to show you who they are. Their impatience surfaces, their assumptions leak, their ethics become visible. That night, Charles and Victoria thought they were controlling tempo. In reality, they were revealing character. And then there's Elena. People love to frame stories like this as fairy tales, the invisible server who becomes an executive. But I don't see it as fantasy. I see it as proof that integrity compounds. Elena did not speak because she wanted recognition. She spoke because she recognized deception. There's a difference. In leadership workshops, we talk about psychological safety, the idea that people should feel secure enough to challenge authority. But psychological safety is meaningless if it only applies upward. What Elena demonstrated was ethical courage without safety. That matters. Because most systemic failures occur not when leaders act unethically, but when bystanders decide silence is safer. I often ask myself, how many deals have been signed under quiet pressure? How many professionals have mistaken composure for ignorance? How many partnerships have collapsed years later because they were built on imbalance from the beginning? Globalization has made proximity easier. It has not made understanding automatic. Cultural intelligence is not a diversity initiative checkbox. It is a competitive advantage. The ability to interpret silence, to respect difference, to slow down when necessary. These are strategic competencies. But beyond strategy, there is something simpler. Respect is efficient. It prevents reputational damage. It protects long-term capital. It attracts partners who think beyond short-term extraction. Mariko's final words that night were not loud. They were not theatrical. She said calmly, "The barrier was never language." I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count, because in that line she dismantled the entire premise of the deception. The obstacle was not vocabulary. It was attitude. When I share this story with young professionals entering global markets, I don't frame it as a cautionary tale about embarrassment. I frame it as a study in perception. If you walk into a room assuming superiority, you stop gathering information. If you mistake quiet for weakness, you expose yourself. If you rely on speed instead of clarity, you trade durability for dominance. And if you ever find yourself in Alina's position, witnessing something that feels wrong, you will face a choice that no corporate manual prepares you for. Speak and risk, or stay silent and participate. I don't believe every confrontation needs to be public. I don't believe every mistake requires destruction. But I do believe this: integrity in business is not abstract. It manifests in moments, specific, uncomfortable moments. That dinner in Seattle wasn't historic because of its valuation. It was historic because 3 different people revealed who they truly were under pressure. And if there's one reason I keep telling this story, it's this: not to shame arrogance, but to remind us that respect is not ceremonial. It is structural. It determines who gets heard, it determines who gets trusted, and sometimes it determines who walks away still standing. When I look back on everything that unfolded, the quiet observation, the calculated arrogance, the unexpected courage, what lingers isn't the humiliation or the reversal of power. What stays with me is how thin the line is between authority and insecurity. In one room during one dinner, we saw 3 different philosophies collide: control without respect, silence with awareness, and courage without guarantee. And in the end, only one of those philosophies created something sustainable. The truth is, competence does not always announce itself loudly. Integrity does not always come from the person at the head of the table. And power, when it is rooted in ego instead of principle, eventually exposes itself. What made this story powerful was not that someone was embarrassed, it was that character was revealed. The ones who tried to manipulate believed they were managing perception. The one who stayed quiet understood she was gathering information. The one who spoke up knew she might lose everything, and spoke anyway. That contrast is what defines leadership in the real world. Not titles, not fluency, not presentation skills, but the ability to act with clarity when pressure tests your values. The deeper lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. Never confuse silence with weakness, and never confuse confidence with superiority. In today's world, whether in business, school, or everyday relationships, we often rush to judge based on surface signals. Someone speaks softly, we assume they lack authority. Someone pauses before responding, we assume they don't understand. Someone holds a lower position, we assume they have less insight. That mindset quietly damages trust and closes doors we don't even realize are closing. How can you apply this lesson right now? Start by slowing down your assumptions. When you enter a conversation, choose curiosity over dominance. Ask one more question before forming a conclusion. Listen fully instead of planning your next response. And if you witness something that feels ethically wrong, evaluate your silence honestly. Is it wisdom or is it fear? Small moments of integrity compound over time. So do small moments of arrogance. Here's a simple question for you. In a difficult situation, would you choose to speak up or stay silent, and why? Please share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us and stay motivated for more meaningful stories like this coming next.